Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of our Need for Seed Symposium. Thank you all for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's program as much as I did. It was really wonderful to hear from the different perspectives, from the national perspective with Dr. Patricia DeAngelis, the wonderful work of Eve Allen in sort of looking at the challenges of building networks and how, as she says, to close those gaps. And I really enjoyed hearing both from Heather McCargo, and her decades-long efforts to promote native plants and native plant use. And certainly from Dina as well, who I think brings in a really welcome perspective from the farming community about the potential for more collaboration in the future between horticulture, the restoration ecology community, and the farming community, which I find really exciting and a very hopeful direction. For today, we have 4 panels set up for you today to dive much deeper into the different aspects of the native plant supply chain or materials development chain, however you want to talk about it. And I hope what becomes apparent throughout the day here and the discussions that we're going to hear is how each and every one of these different aspects of this supply chain really rely upon and inform all of the other aspects of the supply chain. And we've seen a number of diagrams yesterday that look at this sort of in a circle as a visual representation. But there really are lots of threads and arrows that point back and forth between every aspect of this, between seed collection that we'll start with today, the process of increasing that seed, which is really done so that we can kind of take a little bit of pressure off collecting directly from the wild. Exploring all of the different markets. Again, we've seen a little hint at what the demand is and some of the challenges therein. And also, I think really importantly, that the research that's needed to understand more about the increased process, best practices, all of those things really go into and inform the creation of a very successful and effective network. And I think that while there's collectively in all of our panelists here a great deal of experience, I also think that we have a lot to learn and a lot to grow into, which I think is really exciting. So just a few comments regarding housekeeping this morning. Again, I would please ask everyone to be sure that you are muted and that your video is turned off. For each of the panels, we have a number of sample questions prepared to get the conversations going, but we really would welcome and encourage folks to put questions into the chat for the panelists, and that either myself or my colleague Michael will be pulling from those questions to feed into the panel so that the conversation is lively and moving forward. The format will be that we are going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves briefly, so you have a little sense of who they are and the experiences and perspectives that they bring to each panel. But we really want to reserve the bulk of the time for the conversation itself. And again, please make sure that your microphones are muted and so forth. So without any further ado, I should also, pardon me for forgetting this. So after we'll have 2 panels this morning. We'll have a brief lunch break from 12 to 12:30. And then we will resume the panels with 2 afternoon panels. As you can see here, we've got seed collection first, seed increase, a little break, and then seed use and seed research. And then really importantly, and I hope everybody sticks around for this, is that Michael and I will be providing some closing remarks for the whole symposium, and to also give you a little sense of what Native Plant Trust's role and vision is in moving this whole thing forward. We're incredibly honored and excited to have hosted this symposium and are really looking at it as a way to generate conversations and to kind of begin pulling together this larger network. And so we'll be outlining certainly some actionable steps for folks who are interested in getting involved, and outlining where we see our role in this process moving forward. I think that overall, there's this great interest in this really being successful and taking off, and so I hope that you feel as energized as I do after this symposium, and that energy will carry forth into some really meaningful partnerships and collaborations into the future. So I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to turn over the microphone to Michael, who will be moderating our first panel, which is the seed collection panel. Take it away, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Willie. And thanks everybody for being here this morning. We had a really exciting first day yesterday with some great talks, as Willie mentioned. And I think more than anything else, it was clear there was enthusiasm for increasing the native seed supply in this region and folks wanting to be a part of that in that grand collaborative effort that it will be. As Willie mentioned, the 4 panels today really are trying to look at the core areas of that cycle from taking seed from a wild landscape and moving it through the processes of seed increase while still maintaining genetic diversity and local genotypes. In the same way, I think all of these different pieces, whether it's seed collection, seed increase through seed increase plots or founder plots, the use of seed in habitat restoration or nurseries or private home use, all of those things have research components to them. So inevitably, that last panel will summarize a lot of those perspectives. We're trying to see this as a replicable model that's not just Native Plant Trust, but other organizations can take on. And realize that this demand for native seed of ecotypic variety is not possible just through one organization, but through a network of others like yourselves. So we do hope to follow up this symposium with an ability for people to identify what role they might like to have if they want to be part of this, and to understand what Native Plant Trust will be providing. And just in brief, that'll be starting next season, seed collection teams to get some of the original sources of wild plants, wild seeds into this system, as well as seed viability, storage, and seed cleaning that we're all trying to expand now, primarily at Nsambi Farm Nursery. You'll hear more about that later, and right now we want to talk about seed collection. One thing I'll say is that throughout the history of Native Plant Trust, limiting overcollection and exploitation of wild plants in their native landscapes has been a theme. It was the theme of the foundation of this organization way back over 100 years ago, and it still carries through to why we feel this focus on seed also has conservation implications. We worked for several years with others on this panel and on this in this symposium on the Seeds of Success program to provide seed to habitat restoration and other means of combating issues related to Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy. And through that, I think we learned a lot about how this system and supply chain will work. So this morning, the seed collection panel really will focus on the importance of proper protocols in maintaining high quality, genetically diverse seed collections from wild landscapes, while not doing excessive harm or exploiting those populations in situ. We're going to talk a little bit about Seeds of Success, I'm sure, and the protocols and programs that work in that regard. And really, these panelists all have a variety of different experiences on this topic. I will start by just introducing the person in their title, and then I'll allow them to give a little bit longer of an explanation of what they do and where they're coming from. So we can get those slides queued up if you'd like now. All right, great. So on the panel this morning, we have, in alphabetical order, John Berryhill, who is the landscape curator for the Botanic Garden of Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. We have Hope Leeson, who is by many titles, but primarily a field botanist based in Rhode Island. Heather Liljengren, who is the seed collector / field taxonomist for the New York City Parks Greenbelt Native Plant Center in Staten Island. And Dan Jaffe Wilder, who's the director of applied ecology for the Norcross Wildlife Foundation. So we'll start with just an introduction by each of the panelists on the work they do and their focus on seed. So John, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Michael, and good morning, everybody. As Michael said, I'm the landscape curator for the Botanic Garden at Smith College, which is a really eclectic job. We all have to wear a lot of hats to get the work done there, but it's really that curator hat that brings me here today as both a panelist and as an attendee and a learner. We are, as an institution, really at what we're hoping will be a significant pivot point for us as both the Botanic Garden and the college that we're part of are rethinking both what landscape stewardship and teaching collections really look like. Before I give you a quick overview of that, if anyone's not familiar with Smith College or the Botanic Garden there, Smith is a women's liberal arts institution with about 2,500 undergraduate students on about 125 acres in the Connecticut River Valley, Central Mass, and Northampton. I want to acknowledge that that's on the unceded land of the Nonotuck people. And we, the Botanic Garden, have been part of the college almost since its inception in 1895. After a couple decades of operation, our first president, President Seeley, saw the need for really significant campus infrastructure development and expansion. And he had what was really an original idea of the time, which surprised me when I learned this because it's so ubiquitous today. And despite the fact that the history of botanic gardens go back there, they got their start at colleges and universities a couple hundred years prior. But President Seeley had this new idea to incorporate, or I should say, populate the entirety of the planted campus landscape with a scientifically curated teaching collection. And we have been, in our 125 plus years of operation, we've essentially, the curation and the collections building focus has very much been in line with what I think of as the late 19th century and 20th century model of that work, which is Botanic Gardens building these big reference collections of specimens for scientific study and inquiry. And when about 5 years ago, when our new director, Tim Johnson, came on board, one of his first projects was to have our community build a strategic plan. And one important action item that emerged from that was to examine the value and the purpose of our collections here. And if you can go to the next slide, please. That effort resulted in the crafting of our collections management plan that, among other things, really built on the idea that we are no longer building collections based on that question of what plants do we need for our collections as collectors, or viewing our plants as, air quotes here, collectibles in the first place, and sort of turning that question upside down and starting by asking ourselves, what do the living communities that the plants in our collections represent need from us as a botanic garden? And a key example that I think really highlights that change in focus, in ethos, is, and that also connects me to my fellow panelists here, is the idea of building founder plots, seed founder plots on campus that function both as aesthetic teaching gardens, but also as a source of locally adapted seed for habitat restoration. So with that, I'll pass the virtual microphone to my next fellow panelist here.
Thank you, John.
Hi. Just one technical question. How do I advance, or do you advance the slides?
Yeah, Uli will advance the slides.
Uli will advance the slides, okay. So, good morning. Thanks for everyone who's attending. It's a pretty impressive number of people. I as Uli said, or as Michael said, I'm a field botanist primarily. In 2010, I started the Rhode Native Initiative, which was a program of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, which is a nonprofit organization in Rhode Island. And the program was an outcome of a federal workforce grant that we received funding from as a part of training landscape managers in methods of removing invasive species on public and conserved lands around the state. And so an outcome of that, you could switch to the next one, was recognizing that something had to be replaced, some plant material had to replace what we were removing in order to fill in the gaps and try to prevent other invasive species from from the seed from reestablishing. But also that when we were contemplating where we would get plant material, it was primarily horticultural material available at the nurseries locally. And we realized that the genetic diversity of those individual plants would not be very great because they would be produced through cloning or a limited seed source. And so we thought it was worthwhile to begin the process of collecting seed from wild populations and encouraging growers in Rhode Island to propagate from seed. We didn't really realize what we were up against, not having any experience in the horticultural industry ourselves. And so it was a sort of a long slog. And in the end, we ended up doing much of the production ourselves. But, recognizing that seed was really the way to go for all of the reasons that we'll all be discussing later today, and you probably heard about yesterday. So it was a, volunteer-driven program. Myself was the sole for much of the program's life. I was the sole sort of coordinator and driver of the program. We received a number of grants to fund it, and also received some funding from the sale of plants. So we were wild collecting seed in order to produce plant material and sell that F1 generation for habitat restoration and diversification. Could go to the next one. So, and because we were collecting limited amounts of seed and intending to just propagate from that seed, and had limited space, we were really only interested in short-term seed storage. So the seed would be cleaned and, with chaff and fruit tissue removed and then dried to reduce the humidity of the seed, and then really just stored in a refrigerator at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And we would I would every year test the viability of the older seeds, and we would every couple of years recollect and sort of re-add to that seed collection that we had. Go ahead. So in general, we followed the Seeds of Success protocols. I was in conversations at the time with Bill Brumbach from what was the New England Wildflower Society in terms of how to go about this and what to collect and how much to collect. And so these were the sort of basic protocols that we followed, and we really were just collecting common species, or what are termed the workhorse species that could be put into many different populations as as a way of adding diversity to a situation or a restoration project. You could go to the next one. And so, some of the important things that we tried to incorporate into the collections was more rigorous record keeping, particularly field notes. And this is something that we probably should talk about in the rest of the conversation, but in terms of scouting out where populations are viable for collection in advance, and knowing the biology of the plant and knowing the sort of life cycle of the plant. I think the first year that I was working on this, I spent really trying to get a handle on how long it took an individual species to go from flower to seed. And for each species, it was obviously very different. But for me, that was a learning curve that I had to go through to understand, when I could be collecting and how long, how I could time everything. And so, of course, taking GPS locations so that we could go back, or someone in the future could go back and recollect from that location, or collect a voucher specimen if there was a question in terms of the identity of the species, and trying to record population data, and then also seed storage data. And we assigned accession numbers to each collection, which the number in our case had to do with the town. I assigned numbers for each of the towns in the state, and so it had to do with the town as well as the date and whether it was, and the seed type. And the goal was to collect from all towns within the state so that we had coverage of all regions. So that's it. We could go on to the next one now.
Thank you, Hope.
Yeah.
Heather?
Good morning. Can you see my video?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So good morning. I am from the Greenbelt Native Plant Center in New York City and Staten Island. I've been a seed collector since 2008. So I've been doing this for a long time. And our mission at the nursery is to provide native plants and seeds from local plant populations for restoration projects throughout the city. You could go to the next slide. And seed collection is really the basis for all of it. We consider our local native flora to be from 100-mile radius within New York City and then beyond. So we are collecting within that region. It's 25 counties. And we collect in New Jersey, New York, and one county in Connecticut. So we have a unique collection range. I believe, we're in a very unique part of the state of New York. So, and we collect in every different type of habitat. We're collecting, from the coast up into the mountains to really represent all the different type of ecosystems that we have in New York City. Next slide. And I think the reality is that, we're collecting in very different spaces than most. I always like to talk about the dichotomy of New York City, how it's trash and beauty. But really, when you look at both these photos, these are both photos taken within New York City. So there is a vast different group of ecosystems that we do have and types of habitats that we have. Next slide. And really, it speaks to the importance of local adaptations. And our native plants are so tough, and they have figured out how to survive in, these very fragmented, polluted, fill sites. So I really think that, there's value in these local adaptations that are important to collect the seed from these populations and then, pass on those really strong genetics. Next slide. Because New York City is a city of islands, and islands really have kind of this, it's, evolution on steroids. They're so fragmented and isolated in a way, but influenced in so many different ways. And our really critical functioning ecosystems have a look into what climate change is. We have a city of islands that is a hotspot for the heat island effect, and what we see happening to certain species that may be a window into climate change. There are definitely a number of species that have been extirpated from New York City that can no longer exist there, but there are so many that are continuing to survive and thrive and evolve. So it's really looking at this important part of our flora and recognizing that there are still species that can, exist within these parameters. Next slide. I talked about this unique area because there's actually 3 different ecoregions that are represented in New York City, which is pretty amazing. These ecotypes that we find within the 5 boroughs are really important to capture within seed collection. Next slide. So I wanted to show you just a brief example. These photos are from Sandy Hook, it's actually in New Jersey, but part of the Gateway National Park. And it shows you, I think this can really speak to why ecotypes are so important, in the way that our plant populations get different nutrients, and they're exposed to different things that can influence their stature and size, and what's so important about capturing that genetic material. So on the left, you see this beautiful big juniperous tree. It's out there, out there on the coastline, getting all the sun and everything. And then on the right-hand side, you have the same species, but it's this stunted bonsai tree that's growing on the top of the old Fort Hancock. And whenever I come across populations like this, you zero in and you say, oh my gosh, what amazing, cool genetics that I want to capture in this population. These plants have figured out how to create this little niche for themselves and, really thrive. So I think as a seed collector, we need to, kind of reframe our way that we go about collecting. We're not always looking for the biggest, most beautiful trees or shrubs or flowers. We also need to look at those outliers that are so important in what they bring to the actual species and those genetics that they hold. Next slide. And another example I used was the seaside goldenrod. These are 2 pictures that were taken in New York City. On the left is, Solidago sempervirens, all in its glory on the beach and the Rockaways. And then on the right, you have this, plant hanging out in the Gowanus Canal, just, trying to survive. But it really goes to show the evolution of this species and how it's actually been able to evolve and move its range as it loves salt. It really craves that salt. And as we salt our roads and there's all this salt spray from our highways, it's been able to move inward, which is just a perfect example of how plants can evolve. And it's moving on its own. We really don't need to get into the, assisted migration. The species have been figuring out how to do this themselves. Next slide. So at the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, we're doing active seed banking. Everything that we collect is cleaned on site and stored here in our seed bank. And I call it active seed banking because it's just short to midterm storage. This is where our propagator is pulling all of the germplasm from to actually use for propagation at our facility. And this particular seed bank, we have species that, we've been doing germ trials on that they're still viable, after 20 plus years. So, and that really depends on particular plant families as well. But, this is sort of our reservoir that we're always pulling from. Next slide. And really it comes down to making more plants. And, I think that as more and more nurseries hopefully are going to be starting things from seed, if you look to a facility like the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, we've been growing, over 300 and, over 300 to 500 different species from seed. We have so much knowledge and information, and we could be a great resource for so many people who, might have some questions about germination and how to grow these plants. And a lot of it is trial and error, and we're always refining our protocols. But we've been doing this for a long time, and we hope that we can be helpful to others who are potentially just starting out in this type of production. Next slide. And we also have our founder bulk seed plots as well. And, Seth August, who will be speaking on another panel, will speak more about this, but it just goes to show that, in this closed system that we have, all of these plots are started from our wild collected seed. So, it definitely all comes down to that seed, from the start, to make sure that you have that genetic material to be put into increased plots, to then increase the size of seed that you can produce. Next slide. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It all starts with the seed. And you really wanting to capture the genetic variation and adaptive potential. And there's, so many studies that have been done that show, how plants grown from wild collected seed are indeed just going to be a better material at the end of the day and in the long run. So I hope that more seed collection can start to invigorate a lot of these different groups that want to contribute to this huge demand that is definitely all over the East Coast, and definitely wanting to expand into the Northeast. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. That's great. Dan.
Hi, folks. My name is Dan Jaffe Wilder. I'm the Director of Applied Ecology for Norcross Wildlife Foundation. Many of you probably know me through my time at Garden in the Woods, Native Plant Trust. I spent a little bit of time, playing at Nasami, but I was mostly focused on the east side of things. Next slide, please. So Norcross is a little bit of a, oh, my slide got all funky. Go back a bit. So Norcross does a little bit of everything, is kind of the way of putting it. We're a bit of a unique situation. Our major goal is what we like to describe as facilitating biodiverse and resilient habitat in our region. We've been working with, this map comes from the Nature Conservancy. They make some really phenomenal maps. And if you were to imagine sliding that red circle over a little bit, kind of to the middle of that area, Norcross is kind of centered in the center of this Quabbin corridor, which comes out of one of their focal lands maps. And that's the region we really kind of focus our work in. Next, please. So we have, oh, things got really funky here. We've got two kind of either ends of the spectrum that we really work on. So Norcross is lucky enough to have about 8,000, a little more than 8,000 acres of land. Much of that is contiguous habitat. So we really try and focus on keeping that contiguous, connecting habitats whenever possible, if you look at the map of the lands we own, we've got these big chunks, and then every now and then you find these little things, and you think, oh, what is the point of that little something? And if you start looking at other conservation organizations, you might find that our little parcel is connecting, say, a trustees of reservation and a Connecticut state forest, and all of a sudden we've kind of created this larger unit. We're less interested in owning the land than we are in making sure that it is conserved and that those contiguous habitats are connected. And that leads to really nice partnerships with organizations. On the other end of the spectrum, we work with a lot of rare and endangered species. One of the pictures in this funky slide is Lygodium palmatum. It's the American climbing fern. It's an uncommon species in this region, and it's one that we have a nice, big, thriving population at Norcross, and a lot of the management that we do for that specific area is really dedicated to that species. Next. So how we go about doing this is kind of all over the gamut. A lot of it depends on the goals of the specific site. This picture here is one of our active restoration sites. We call it Chapin Meadow. It's a lot more than just a meadow, but that's the name. It's a pine barren restoration, grassland restoration, a couple associated habitats. We spend a lot of time recently working in these kind of fire adapted habitats, because when you start looking at the rare species list, you realize that when you look at the terrestrial species, at least about half of them exist in these fire adapted habitats. So it's become a real focus of ours because of that. The picture on the bottom there is New Jersey tea. If you look in the background of that top image, you see the canopy in there looks pretty thin. We did some logging recently, pretty much to cut out all the mesophytic species and leave pitch pines, oaks, and other kind of fire adapted species in place. And since doing that, all of a sudden New Jersey tea is starting to show up. It's there in the seed bank. We hoped it was there. We really had no knowledge that it might have been. And we're starting to see, this is a very early stage restoration, but we're starting to see signs that the ecosystem is showing what it can be. A lot of that is also reversing kind of past historic human degradation. This grassland, I angled this picture nicely so you could see, kind of milkweeds and asters and goldenrods in this picture. If I'd angled it differently, what you'd see is a sea of reed canary grass. We do a lot of post-agricultural restoration work, a lot of old abandoned pastures that are really just invaded at this point. And we look at those and say, could that be a meadow? Could that be a grassland? Should we reforest it? Should it be active agriculture? Again, partnerships. And then a lot of this comes down to invasive species management. We try and take a very realistic approach to that. If we've got 8,000 acres, the majority of them are to one extent or another invaded. Some of them very badly, some of them very lightly. And I could blow my entire budget on invasive species management and have very little to show for it. So we really try and focus, okay, where would our efforts really make sense? Where would they be the most effective? Are we trying to protect a rare species, and in which case we get it more priority? We also do wow, these got really funny. All right, so we do a lot of augmentation on our landscape. One of the advantages of having a lot of land is that you can collect seed on your land, grow that out, and then plant it on your land. Maybe in the same site, sometimes we have a rare population that we're trying to simply augment that population, and we'll collect from that population, eventually plant right back into it. In other cases, it's collected from one site on Norcross lands and planted on another. So we're constantly increasing the diversity in certain sites. A lot of this post-agricultural stuff, when we're sowing large amounts of seed, we'll sow little blue stem seed, and then we'll see what emerges. And assuming nothing else emerges, that's when we come in with our propagators and say, okay, what species should we be putting into this ecosystem? The native seed bank is not there anymore, or isn't demonstrating itself, or isn't coming up, and that's when we kind of play a more direct approach. And that's something that happens both on the common species side of things as well as on the rare species side of things. The top picture is fringe gentian. We've got a population of that on site that our management is really based around. Really, it's just timing your mowing practices for that area. The bottom is lupin. We've got a couple populations of lupin on site. None of them originated on the lands where they currently live, but all of them originated in local towns. And in about 50% of the cases, the population that we are now growing is all that's left. The original population is now gone, and we've to one extent or another rescued that population by collecting seed, getting it planted on Norcross lands. I dream one day of being able to put it back where it came from, but in the meantime, we can make sure that it stays healthy on our lands in applicable areas. Next. So keep going a bit. So what do we do with seeds? We're both, the question earlier was, are we a supplier or do we demand seed? And frankly, we're both. We collect large amounts of seed on Norcross lands. A lot of it is for our own uses. That being said, we're always happy to partner with anyone we possibly can. And whether that means I'm trading seed, giving plants away. We work with a lot of researchers that'll come onto our land and do research, but also what we'll do is we'll ask them, hey, what do you need? This picture on the bottom, Prunella vulgaris, is one that I've been growing for a couple of years now, and I've had a lot of people say, I can't get that on the landscape. And when the person who's saying that happens to be, say, a rare bee researcher, I say, how many do you need? And we'll grow out 300 or 400 or 500 of these and pass them on and let them go to use somewhere else so that we can kind of be a supplier in that manner, whether it be of seed or of the finished plants. We're also establishing founders plots to produce larger amounts of seed for species that we feel we need more of. A lot of that is in partnership with the folks, in this panel. John, Michael, Uli, we've been working with regularly in a founders plots kind of partnership. We also do a little bit of it for our own entirely own purposes. The Prunella is one that we put into a founders plot because we want so much more of it than is currently available. Next, please. And then, as I said, we're also a source of demand. And frankly, we demand a lot more seed than we supply. I would love to one day be able to produce all the seed we need. I don't think that's a very realistic goal, but it's something we'll kind of push towards anyway, because it's, halfway there would still be a real improvement. In terms of what we're looking for on seeds, sometimes we're looking for seeds that we can't source on our own lands. We've got a lot of land. It's a real blessing, but it doesn't mean we've got everything. It's kind of it's this weird dichotomy. I've got 8,000 acres to work with. It seems like a lot. And then when you start looking at the region and the challenges and everything else that's going on, you realize it's really still also just a little blip. It's not an entire region in itself. It's not an eco, it's a lot and it's a little, if that makes any sense. So we're looking for more plants. The other thing is sometimes we're looking for quantity of seed that we can't produce ourselves. I'm looking to sow 12 acres of little blue stem. I can't supply 12 acres of little blue stem seed. That's about 380 pounds of little blue stem seed. That's well beyond my capabilities. So that's when we're looking for organizations that can supply us with that amount of seed. And, you can't, as we'll talk about plenty more in this, you can't just grab any seed. I can't be picking up seed from Florida or California and say it's going to do fine in my region. So we're constantly trying to figure out the best ways to go about doing this. Next, that might be the last. Is that my last? That is my last. Thank you all so much. I look forward to talking more about this.
All right, cool. Well, that was a lot. I appreciate all of the background in everyone's work. We have a lot of questions coming in through the chat, and I feel like I might be able to summarize the first one by talking about pre-collection steps. Regarding permits, regarding determining wild origin of a species before you collect it, or plant ID, what are your steps to ensure quality seed collection that is genetically diverse and above board? How do you approach that? And if you can comment on it, I wonder about the difference in getting permits for perhaps a commercial use through a nursery versus for maybe habitat restoration or otherwise, maybe through nonprofit use. And if you'd like to answer, feel free to just jump in. And if you want to comment after initial speaker, just put up your hand raise icon. Pre-collection steps. Hope.
I can comment, sure. Yeah, so the aspect of getting permission is really important, and having a relationship with the organization or landowner as an individual that you are collecting from is also important. And there, what I had done was I had a letter that I would send out requesting permission and explaining what I would be doing, how much of a population I would be collecting, what species in particular I was going to be collecting from. Prior to this, I would have gone, if it was a public land site, like a land trust property or state property, or federal, I would have gone to the site and as part of scouting out where a viable large population of different species was. And then once I knew where I wanted to collect, then I would ask permission. And the state has some hesitations about, as do the federal agencies, about allowing permission unless it's specifically for a project for state land or for federal land to grow out species. So that's often the relationship that I had with those two entities. Land trusts were much more open to allowing me to go in and collect seed. I specifically wanted to stress, though, that I was not going to be selling the seed that I was collecting, that the wild collected seed was just for propagating the next generation of plants to go back into the landscape or to be sold as nursery stock if that was the fate of it.
That last point is really important to Hope. I appreciate you bringing that up. It is
Yeah.
a matter of not necessarily using the wild collected material right away for sale, but instead for increasing the seed available that some of it might go through commercial uses. It's important.
Yeah, I mean, and from a practical standpoint, collecting wild seed to sell is really, it's very time consuming. And so it doesn't make sense on a large scale unless you're, you know, out in the West and you've got large machinery and large seed cleaning equipment and larger landscapes and larger populations. We just don't tend to have that around here.
Thank you. Good point. John, I saw your hand up.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Well said, Hope, first of all. And I'll add that we've actually come a long way on this. We've been collecting as part of an international seed exchange with a network of botanic gardens around the globe, and been collecting native seed for that purpose for quite some time. And until very recently, we'd sort of been taking advantage of the fact that the laws governing such seed collection are particularly on common species, which is all we were really collecting, are essentially non-existent. And we pretty much said anything on roadside right-of-ways, even if that was for roadside on private property, was up for grabs, and it made collecting extremely easy. So I appreciate that question's being asked, because I think we as a community need to build some better and more broadly shared standards that one can guide us as collectors, and also that we can communicate with these people we're seeking permission from. The short answer to that question is certainly seek permission, regardless if it's public land, private land, as to echo Hope's point about being clear about the intent of use, particularly a commercial versus non-commercial use, is that kind of clarity is extremely important. And I'll also add that as we build these networks, if you can do it not as an individual, it's been very helpful as we've been that pivot in collections building ethos that I described in the intro has connected us to places like the Native Plant Trust and Dan over at Norcross, and being able to leverage the goodwill and reputation that those institutions have built, and mention that connection with the seed is being aimed at a collaborative effort, I think actually really draws a lot of positive reactions from people we're seeking permission from. I'll end there.
Yeah, I want to add something to what Hope mentioned. Hope mentioned having a letter that, you know, can be sent out to ask for permission, which I think is a fantastic idea and allows you to really kind of organize thoughts. On the other end of the spectrum, I think sometimes it's great to be able to actually talk to people, whether in person or on the phone. Sometimes it's just that it's a little harder to say no when you're actually talking to someone face to face, and you tend to get permissions. But other times I find that when I come to people, you know, as a representative for the organization and just start talking about what we're trying to do, you can really form a relationship there that becomes more than just a permission to collect seed, and it becomes they become a part of the process. Maybe not an active part, maybe not a big part, but it creates a connection that I've found becomes quite helpful. I've had a couple folks that we've kind of had a very what was supposed to be a brief kind of can I collect seed conversation that ended up turning into a, hey, yeah, you can collect seed. Do you know I've also got some land over here? Or let me talk to my neighbor, or let me talk to the organization I work for. And And sometimes what starts off as a simple question turns into a real relationship. And there's certain power, and I know I definitely got into plants because I don't in general like people. And sometimes getting out of that mindset and actually talking to people has really made a big difference. And it's something that I think we ought to do a bit more of sometimes.
I just want to add a couple things as well. I think to include in the letter that you're self-insured is a huge point of action that will maybe get you in. Liability always ends up being a huge thing. I mean, even coming, as somebody that works for the city of New York, they want to know that we're self-insured, that they're not going to be liable if we get hurt on their property or anything like that. So having that in there, I'm self-insured, they can sign it, you can sign it, that's huge. And then also a thing that we do at the end of every collection season, we send a collection report to each person that we get a permit from. And we tell them, every species that we collected on their land, we give them the date, we'll give them GPS points if they want to know any more and further information. And then also a caveat always in our permit is that if they ever want any of that seed back that's in our seed bank, they have access to it. So it ends up being this reciprocal relationship where you allow us to come, they have full well knowledge that we're going to be using this seed for propagation. But if they have any desire to get any of this seed back that's been cleaned and packaged in seed bank, they can reach out and we will be able to give that seed to them if it still exists within our seed bank.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Heather. And Dan made a similar point. I do think ultimately tying the person to the landscape they're on can be achieved through them understanding that there's, maybe a closer relationship they can have with the phenology of the plants around them and the species diversity where they are too. So yeah, we do a very similar thing with seed collections we make as well. And I think it's wise to building a relationship just to communicate that way. Heather, a question specifically for you that showed up, and I know I've dealt with this challenge as well in trying to source wild seed collections. How do you go about determining a wild population as opposed to one that perhaps blew in from, an ecotype that came originally from Florida or the West Coast or something like that? How do you approach that?
Well, we try to be the best informed that we can be. Working in a place like New York City, there are plenty of restoration projects that have occurred. And, I think knowing the land history is really important wherever you are. Understanding the surroundings that you're in and what could be the outside influences is important as well. I think we're lucky in the fact that a lot of restorations have used our material. So if indeed, a natural area is near a restoration site, if those genes are indeed mixing, it might not, be the detriment that is potentially there with another source material. But it is something to always question. But I think really understanding the land history and, plants are also spontaneous. So, these spontaneous populations that show up, how they got there, did they blow in from someone else's garden or, I think it's just understanding the species itself and how it disseminates. I think a lot of people aren't planting the common native species that, we're collecting out in natural areas to begin with. They're not, very, garden, they're not garden popular for the most part, but the ones that are, I think we often question sometimes if we see a species in a park that we're just like, why is this here? This seems a little weird. And if we have those questions, we just don't collect it. So I think making those in the field decisions just has to do with your knowledge of the landscape, your knowledge of the surrounding areas, and the potential for, guarded escapees that might be there.
That's great, and I think it is really tricky. I've definitely been in the field with interns or others in tow trying to learn from me, being very certain something was as wild as possible, and then finding a plant label with $5.99 on it on the ground and being embarrassed. But botany keeps you humble that way, I guess. One question that it came up as well was just in those of you that have maintained plots for seed increase, how are you maintaining genetic diversity between maybe generations or on perhaps a 5-year window, such as Society for Ecological Restoration recommends in their seed increase protocols?
All right, so I'm hoping someone else can really address this because I don't think I have a ton of experience with this, but I think I've got something tangential that's worth talking about. This is actually a bed. We put together a few beds for wild strawberry production, and these beds are mostly division beds. So this is not actually seed increase. This is I guess you'd call it a founder's plot. This is a weird thing, but I think it's worth talking about, where we've created a bed for wild strawberry production. The idea mostly being for a lot of our kill your lawn stuff is replacing it with something else. Wild strawberry is a pretty common one. There's probably a decent number of people in this audience who have received wild strawberries from me to one extent or another. And we were doing this at first, and we were having trouble with the thought that we had this bed that actually originally came from Garden in the Woods plants that I had dug up, brought to Norcross, created this bed. I'm going to guess entirely, but I'm going to say we maybe had 15 individuals that created this bed. So we're dividing and dividing and dividing, and it's really just cloning and cloning and cloning and cloning of what was originally a pretty narrow genetic pool. So we kind of decided that, some plants were better than no plants, and we continued doing this for use at Norcross. And at the same time, we started growing out wild strawberries from wild collected seed. Wild strawberries, for being a pretty darn fast plant, once it's kind of got up and moving, is slow in those early stages. Those early seed stages are a lot slower than you would expect for a fast moving plant. So we grew on these plants. We grew out about, somewhere in the range of 600 plugs. And we started planting these out in a new bed. And that bed has just matured to the point where now, as we continue to take divisions, we're no longer dividing out of the original bed. We're now dividing out of this new seed-grown wild strawberry bed. So now we've gone from cloning of 15 individuals to cloning of 600 individuals. Definitely not a perfect world, but a step in the right direction. And as we go about doing this, we are also continuing to collect more seed from the wild. And each time we go into this bed of 600 individuals and divide out and build holes in it, we go and replant those areas with this new genetic material that we're constantly, kind of working in. So we found what we're considering kind of a happy medium. It's still not a perfect situation. This is still a cloning operation, but it's a cloning with the idea that we're going to constantly be trying to bring in new genetic material, try and keep our genetic stock as robust as possible for a plant that we frankly cannot get enough of through current seed-only growing means. And it leads me back to I don't know if I'd call it an argument because that's dangerous, but there's we're always trying to do the best we can. And sometimes we find ourselves needing to step back and say, okay, we can't do the best. How good is good enough where it's worth doing? Versus at what point do you say, this is just really not good enough and we cannot do this because the genetic pool is too narrow or the diversity is too narrow or for a number of other issues. And that's something I struggle with regularly. I always want seed grown, I want genetically diverse, I want a wide diversity geographically, but not too wide where it's a problem from a seed transfer zone. Where is that line, between saying, okay, this is good enough to move forward, and at what point do you say this is not good enough, and what does that do to your project? Does that mean you now have to stop and you're not doing anything, in which case you've got, I think, a poor situation. So I don't know if that's exactly the answer to the question that was asked. If anything, I probably just brought up 3 others, but I'd love to hear someone else's opinions on all of it.
That's the thing. I think best practices is the term we have to go back to a lot of the time, because we won't have those totally objective defined, parameters to go by in a lot of cases. But I do hope that is why the research component is brought in as well, so we can actually understand what's going on genetically with some of these increase plots. Other comments on that before we move on to the next question?
Well, we had very limited experience trying to establish founder plots. But I did go down to Greenbelt Native Plant Center and learned from you, or not from you, Heather, but from Ed Toth, but that the beds there were changed out every 3 years to prevent that genetic drift that could happen in 5 years or 3 years. And because they were seeing declines in germination after 3 years, I believe. Is that true? And so that same sort of reinvigorating, taking out plants and re-adding a new F1 generation into the plot bed is important.
Yeah, and just to expand upon that, and I think Seth will talk about this in the seed increase panel, but we try to start a plot with at least 3 to 5 different wild collections to really maximize that diversity, to have this really rich diversity off that harvest. So we're bringing in, 3 to 5 different populations that, because of fragmentation, and they're just, they would never be able to exchange genes, out in the wild. So we're creating this, really strong genetically diverse harvest. And, it is after the 3 to 4 or 5 years that we see sort of a decline in the seed production, and we will till under the bed and then start again.
That's great to know. I want to ask a question about more of the future, I guess, post-collection in general. How do you see the approach you've taken now shifting with changing climates in the region, whether that's eco-regional focus or other ecotypes that are beyond the current ecoregions you work in? Have you considered that?
I can start. This is an easier question to answer with respect to just general collections building, and I appreciate that it's being asked in the context of building seed production beds, because as I think I've heard Dan point out before, that we're not predicting with climate change that it's just going to be a little bit warmer, and sooner or later we're going to have a Pennsylvania winter and a Virginia winter after that, but rather there's going to be the volatility that favors species with, to use the jargon term, phenotypic plasticity, that have a lot of adaptations to extremes built into their genome. And questions about what we prioritize are going to become much more salient as we see some, does that mean that we lean on those from a collections building perspective? I think of Smith going to 2 extremes. As we build the landscape plants, we need those plants with the phenotypic plasticity that are going to be the next generation of 100-year-old trees, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we're looking at rare species, because those ones with the adaptive capacity are usually the common, broadly distributed ones that we need to be worried about conserving the genetics of those rare species. And I very much see us bringing those questions to seed collecting work as well. But it's also very tricky when we're just talking about habitat restoration. My mind immediately goes to, we want plants that will succeed there, but are we doing that at the cost of ignoring the ones that are suffering in the face of that increased climactic volatility? Not really an answer to the question, but just what my mind, where my mind goes when I hear it.
Sure, yeah.
I think collecting from stressed plants is just as important as collecting from plants that are less stressed. And because of that plasticity or adaptability that they may be holding in their genetic material. I also, wonder about species that, in the future, about the viability of them in terms of seed production. I know we've had trouble with species like a huckleberry, Gay-Lussacia baccata, in drought years producing viable seed. And then also other species that are moss, that the seeds land on moss and then germinate in moss. And if we're having more drought years like we did this year, and that moss is drying out, what will be the viability of those species in the future in terms of their seed production. They also have vegetative production that they rely on, but so yeah, I mean, climate change brings a lot into it, but hopefully in the adaptability of the plants themselves that we can try to collect those changes that are happening and reproduce those that may be more successful plants on the landscape.
Right. Yeah. And I think this was touched upon in some of the pre-collection steps of ensuring, wide ecoregional coverage of a diversity of different plants, of, different fitness, perhaps, just to kind of cover all the possible bases that the plant may adapt into in the future. A question just about the future, and we'll wrap up with this. We're a little over time on the panel, but it's all been great. How do you see engaging the future of folks getting into seed collection, whether it's for nursery use or for habitat restoration use specifically? What has your correspondence been with maybe younger individuals or people that are new to this field and getting them started? What have you found that works for education and how to get enthusiasm built? And we want to know that too, as I'm sure many do attending today.
Internships.
Sure.
We try to convert as many as we can. But I think, I just think it's the education piece of it. There's such a difference of, being in school and going through a program and, maybe you spend 2 weeks out in the field, for your thesis program or whatever, but that doesn't at all touch what you could learn in a season, or even like an entire summer being out in the field with somebody to learn from them. So, we have found that having interns, come out and do seed collection with us, it just changes their world. I mean, it opens them up to a whole new world they didn't even know existed. So I think, really having those opportunities is the best thing that we can do and offer, and convert all those people to plant people forever.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would strongly second that. I mean, the Natural History Survey is fortunate to be housed on the campus of the University of Rhode Island. And so we always had interns from the university, and it was a really rewarding experience all around. And it really made a big difference in terms of who could, I found a lot that the older people that I was trying to cultivate as volunteers for seed collecting were much more hesitant in terms of feeling comfortable that they could learn the skills that they needed. But younger people are less inhibited in that way. And I think there's also a much more of a focus on foraging for people now. And I think, inherently in us is this forager instinct. I think all of us who collect seeds are, these ancient genetic foragers. And so I think that people are out there that have that predisposition, and but yeah, getting them to realize that they can do this and that they could love doing this is important.
Thank you, Hope.
I'll add too, and I'm grateful that you mentioned this question, because I actually think that my mind went to this one. I think it was Dina yesterday that was talking about, like, we need to increase the demand for this work for it to be a viable path for, especially for farmers and the commercial land garden centers and whatnot. But as working at a college, I actually, the reason we pivoted this way, I talked about value and sense of purpose of the collections. Botany globally is very much in recession worldwide. The way that botanic gardens used to be built, that reference library model, definitely gave the impression that collections at botanic gardens were for plant geeks to geek out on plants. You can look at what the style and a stigma look like on an aesculus versus an orchid versus a daffodil or such, or look at taxonomy and anatomy. And that was a very siloing approach. And people don't come to Smith, they don't come to Norcross and places like that to garden, well, maybe to Garden Woods, but to some of these institutions wanting to be that, that kind of plant geek, what we used to think of as a botanist. But they do come to colleges understanding the biodiversity loss crisis, wanting to do something about it, wanting to see that work being done, wanting to see a path for that energy that they have. And I feel like this work does so much of it. One founder plot and the story behind it and the connections that it makes to other people doing the work that people on this panel are doing have so much more impact than having, say, a magnolia collection. It used to be a good collection was if you had every cultivar of magnolia, that was an award-winning or noteworthy collection. That is a useless collection. That is a collection for people, for the collector. Seeing the human hand creating what the human mind wants in the plant world. And this is a celebration of what the plants have built as communities, as individuals, as species. And it is a really compelling story, and it's incredibly easy to sell, and it's generating energy that I haven't seen before for Botanic Gardens work.
It's very helpful. Thank you, John. Dan?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief because I know we're a bit over. I want to jump back to the internship idea for a quick moment, because I think internships are frankly phenomenal. It's how I got started. It changed my life. I think there's also an important point to make that a lot of internships out there are unpaid or underpaid and are something that are very exclusionary, and the fact that if you can't afford it, you can't get involved, and that's a real problem. I think it's really essential. It's something we've really argued hard for at Norcross, to make these internships something that are financially viable, as well as a fantastic experience from an educational point of view and everything else it brings. I think it leads us to another bigger issue that we don't have time to deal with now, that there's really not a market for this work because of the way things are set up. A lot of us got into this industry because we're passionate about it. We believe about it. We accept the fact that we're going to make little money because we really care. And I think that leads to this larger issue that from a kind of policy point of view, we're not paying for clean air, clean water, species diversity. All these things we care about so much are not really looked at in a monetary manner. And I kind of hate the idea of calling this all as a monetary argument. But at the same time, that is a kind of realistic nature of the world we live in, is that we all need these things. Yet a lot of people don't recognize that the water coming out of your tap is related to the native plants we're planting on the landscape. A lot of indirect steps in between there. But yeah, I think that what I'm trying to get at here is that if there's anyone in this audience who doesn't think that the idea of getting into law and politics and policy is gross the way I do, there's a phenomenal need for it. People who can make these kind of systemic changes that could lead towards allowing more people to get into this world, whether they're able to financially at the current moment or not. It's a major issue and a big issue, and one that I have more questions than I have answers for. That being said, I'll put in the shameless plug. If anyone's interested in a well-paid internship, please come to Norcross Wildlife Foundation. We would love to have you.
Thank you, Dan, and we'll welcome that plug. Similarly, toward the end of this the symposium day 2 today, we will talk about some of the positions that will be coming out from Fish and Wildlife Service grant that we received to increase seed collection and seed availability. So we'll talk about that later. I do think that is a crucial piece of getting people engaged that typically haven't been or have had that barrier to joining up. I faced it myself, as I'm sure many others in this room have. But I do appreciate all of the thought on seed collecting and the philosophical overhead that relates to it. But we will wrap up this discussion and move on to our next panel, which will be focused more on seed increase. So you can ask those more practical points about plot management and how to get it started and how to keep it going. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists, Hope Leeson, Heather Liljengren, John Berryhill, and Dan Wilder. Thank you so much for this great discussion. Round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you all. It's been a
Thanks.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, and I believe Uli Lorimer will be moderating the next.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you, our panelists. Just give us a moment as we swap over. Also wanted to add that Native Plant Trust, as a shameless plug, also offers well-paid internships in horticulture and conservation and plant propagation. So make sure you keep your eyes out or pass those opportunities on to other folks. Without further ado, I know we're a little bit behind, but we're going to be shifting over to seed increase. So our panel here is really emphasizing the next step in the supply chain, which is the use of agronomic techniques to increase seed production in a cultivated setting, essentially with the eye of maintaining genetic diversity. And we've touched upon this a little bit already with some of the questions for the collection. So I think it'll be a good transition over. But as we've discovered, there's a lot of variables to consider between germination rates and pollination systems and harvest times and techniques and all these things that kind of play into a successful seed increase program. And so with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists, Sefra Alexandra, the seed huntress, Seth August, who's the administrator of the Founder Seed Program for Greenbelt Native Plant Center, Clara Holmes, who is a plant ecologist for New York City Parks Division of Forestry, Horticulture, and Natural Resources, and my good friend Polly, who is the Science and Stewardship Program Manager for the Central Pine Barrens Commission, as well as being the founder of the Long Island Native Plant Initiative, for which she has done fantastic work in the New York and Long Island region in promoting and increasing seed availability. So as we wait for Polly to join us, I'm going to share my screen so that Sefra can get going with her introduction. So please just allow me one moment here, and we will get started. Sefra, are you ready?
Always.
Okay, so here we go. You're up.
Okay, I think the best part of the Zoom world is you can all watch this on slow motion because I talk really fast and go through a lot of things quickly here. But it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. So nice to see so many colleagues and friends. Really makes these first couple slides I'm going to go through really easy to just skim over. But I call myself the seed huntress. I've been working in seed conservation for a decade all over the world. And I start with like true reverence for the seed. I come from the unceded lands of the Pagasit Golden Hill tribe, from the beautiful lands, and it's with that stewardship and reverence for these embryos, these seeds, that I do this work. We all know now that we work under the auspices of a national seed strategy. We all need to figure out how we can have more seed. So if you go to the next slide, we're figuring out a shared framework and templates. So Restoration Ecology has done great work around that, and the International Network for Seed-Based Restoration. Next slide. So now we know that we have to go very far distances to find ecotypic seed. And so we need to, as Ken Green called it, fortify seed sheds, just like we know our watershed. Let's collect and grow and share seeds all within a seed shed. So thank you, Ed and Sarah and Shannon, one of the founders of the Ecotype Project, for this work. Okay, next slide. So an ecotype, just by definition, is that wild type, and we that truly local genetic material. So we can go to the next slide, but that's going to be your most genetically appropriate material to do restoration. And now we know we're looking through the framework of ecoregions. Go ecoregion 59. So we're putting the right plants in the right place. If you saw Dina's presentation, you would know that this is how the Ecotype project that I've been leading works. We work with botanists who wild collect that F0 seed. We bring organic farmers on to grow out those different species. We then collect and clean the seed, get it to the nursery growers, and get it back out to you all, to the end users, and to the restoration projects where it's needed. So that's how it works. We work under the SOS protocols. We like, Mona Lisa taking a selfie. Let's start asking questions about provenance when we want to know about our seed. And that's Jordy Elkins, one of our main seed collectors. So if we go to the next slide here, thank you, Heather McCargo, for this beautiful image. As a woman from the South said, she was like, when you're considering bloom times in your garden, it's like inviting house guests over for a week and only feeding them on Monday, y'all. So when we bring species into our program, we want to make sure we're considering bloom times all throughout the season. So the next slide finally will show you the species. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, here we go. So this is just some of the species. Oh, back one. This is just some of the species that we're working with. We have about 27 species now. A few different milkweeds and mountain mints and goldenrods, asters. You can see there's some of our founder plot farmers looking for night pollinators on the black-eyed Susan. So the next slide. So what happens next? How do we get this F0 seed out of the wild and into the founder plots? So the next slide will show you, there's Jesse Hubbard, who is at Highstead as well. So from our seed collectors, they start these different species, they up pot them until they have them in 72s. And so those bigger trays, and they really caretake them quite well until they're big enough plugs to be able to be transplanted. So then I take 3 of those trays, which is about 210 plugs, because a traditional founder plot is 200, and I bring them to the different farmers. So the next slide will show you some of the farmers that we work with. We work all over Connecticut because I've been doing this work for the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Connecticut. So we're in very rural areas and in urban areas, which is great for growing out seed because it has isolation distances from wild populations. So the next slide. So why is an organic farming association caring about seed increase? Well, blueberries on the left, not well pollinated. The ones on the right, well pollinated. So basically, as Dina Brewster says, these insects are paying the farmers wages, right? We don't have the food they need on the farm. We're not going to have local food security we need. So next slide. The Ecotype project has been functioning under a USDA specialty crop block grant, where the specialty crop is the ecotypic seed. So for 4 years, we've been having this conversation. So what happens next? Do we just drop those plugs off with the farmers and say, good luck? No, we've had to create these getting started toolkit cards because if you see those like old index card boxes that they had, what we've done and what Jean Linville, the head founder plot farmer at the Hickories, has done is said, this is what you need to think about for a multi-year overview of when you're planting these perennials, right? Because a lot of these farmers have A, never grown seed before, or B, maybe never worked with native perennials. So it talks about spacing, what to think about for multi-year planting. If you go to the next slide, it goes by species. So it tells you what type of site locations they like, what type of beneficial insects you can see on them. And then we have a grower's field notes card because this is a living document. It's a collaborative effort to figure out best practices. And these are all free downloadable PDFs on the Ecotype project website. Next slide, we're getting there. And this is what the founder plots look like. They're beautiful. So you have the Joe Pieweed and New York Ironweed. And that's at the Hickories farm, Dina Brewster's farm in Ridgefield. So next slide. Then what happens? Well, they go to seed. And so we are collecting for the widest amount of diversity possible. So we collect those plants that first go to seed in the beginning of the seeding season, and in the middle and at the end, because we want to preserve all of the arcs of diversity presented in those founder plots. So the next slide will show you then on the back side of those cards, we say, what does the seed look like? Because for all of you seed collectors out there, you're like, is that it? I don't know. Maybe that's it. Okay. In an effort to wrap up, if you go to the next couple slides here. So we're collecting more seed. We have a great winnow wizard so we can clean that seed, which makes it available finally commercially by Eco59, farmer-led seed collective that Dina Brewster talked about yesterday, which is awesome. The seed's finally available. And then one more slide, just in terms of increasing seed, one more past that. I've also started leading these botanical expeditions where we plant these native seeds back in the living seed bank to let nature use all of its myriad dispersal mechanisms to make these seeds back available. So thank you for letting me do a fast-paced tour of the Ecotype project and excited to hear from the rest of the panelists.
That was fantastic, Sefra. Thank you very much. And we're going to turn it over to Seth. Take it away, Seth. I think you're still muted, sir.
Really good point. Hey, thanks for having me. I'm Seth. I'm the program manager of the Founder Seed Program at the Greenbelt Native Plant Center. You can go to the next slide. We're part of the Parks Department, as you may have heard from other people in this program. The program started, I won't talk a lot about the nursery, but the program started in the mid-2000s to grow seed for the city. Around that time and ongoing, there's the Fresh Kills Dump, which is many acres to seed. We're trying to do that around the city. There's 10,000 acres of forests and wetlands and salt marshes, and the city was looking for native seed, locally sourced, pretty broad genetics, and that's what we're doing. I took over a little over a year ago. Here are some photos of our field production. We've got 6 acres around the city, a little bit less than that in active production at 3 different sites. Over the course of the program, we've grown about 80 species. Right now, we've got about 50 in production. They're mostly your pretty common natives, your goldenrods and asters and milkweeds, a lot of grasses, sedges. That's about it. A lot of what we do, harvesting, seed cleaning, mostly done by hand harvesting, small scale collection. If you go to the next slide, we have some of our machines, our harvest, our facility, have a pretty good medium to small scale seed cleaning facility with a lot of pretty cool machines from around the world. That's our little strawberry berry harvest, something smaller, a common milkweed harvest on the lower right. And yeah, our last slide, these are some of the sites that, one back, that we've given seed to, one forward. There we go. There's a happy customer contractor seeding a sandy area in the Rockaways, a marine park, Riverside Park. We haven't really scaled up yet to meet the demand for the city, but working on it. A cool part of the Parks Department is that we're big and pretty vertically integrated, in very active conversation with our seed collectors and the people doing the restoration work. We have a lot of knowledge of the species that we see in the wild, what our habitats look like, what they used to look like. One of the downsides is that we're pretty disconnected from the larger region and other groups doing restoration work. So we're growing founder seed. We're doing it for a while. It goes pretty well. There are some challenges. One of the big challenges is that a lot of the knowledge comes from Midwestern and Western states and prairie restoration or wildfire responses. And we're doing a lot of weird coastal woodland stuff in the city with a lot of invasive pressure and human pressure and people pressure. So it's a cool place to work with a lot of challenges. And I think that's about it.
All right, thank you, Seth. We're going to pass the mic over to Clara next. Welcome, Clara.
Thanks, Willie, and Sefra and Seth and Polly and the panelists from the Seed Collection panel. It's great to be here. I'm Clara Holmes, a plant ecologist with New York City Parks. And nowadays, a lot of my work in the 5 boroughs mostly revolves around tracking some of our rare plants, some of our locally sensitive species, keeping an eye on the flora we have remaining, and a lot of wetland monitoring. I do a lot of salt marsh restoration monitoring since we are a city of islands and we have a lot of salt marsh remaining. And a fair amount of project management where I see a lot of the demand for need within the, demand for seed within the 5 boroughs. And so I see a lot of that need now. And before this position, I worked as a coordinator for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank for about 5 years. And with that program, it was kicked off through grant programs. It was associated with the Greenbelt Native Plant Center while I was working there. So I'm very familiar with what Heather and Seth have been talking about and the processes there as well. And the goal of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank was really to take the model of the Greenbelt Native Plant Center and sort of expand it throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, which was defined sort of based on where other organizations, including the Native Plant Trust, were doing work. And so we were sort of left with about 7 states in the Mid-Atlantic, ranging from Eastern Ohio through Long Island, south to Virginia, and throughout the state of New York, leaving New England to the Native Plant Trust and some of the southern states to other active organizations down there. And in the early days, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank was really aiming to reach out to folks that were interested and sort of spread the word about the importance of using local genetics and restoration projects and how to go about collecting seeds. So there was a whirlwind of workshop tours for a long time. And then we partnered with the Native Plant Trust and worked with Michael for a number of years to collect seed from coastal habitats to help restore Hurricane Sandy landscapes, or landscapes that were damaged by Hurricane Sandy. And so a lot of the work that I did with that was closer to the seed collection end of things. And now I've worked with Seth some to try to understand and assess our needs for seed within the city and how we can get there, because as Seth mentioned, you know, we're still in the process of scaling up. We can't meet all of the needs within the 5 boroughs. And then, you know, realizing that that's just a very small subset of the needs within the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic area. So I'm happy to be here today and talk to you guys about, you know, ways we can work together to increase the availability of seed throughout the region.
All right. Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you for being succinct so we can try to get ourselves back on time. And our final panelist that I'm thrilled to welcome is Polly Wiegand. Take it away, Polly.
Oh, thank you, Uli, for inviting me to speak and share about what the Long Island Native Plant Initiative does. As you can see, I have a lot of different associations. I'm the executive director for the Long Island Native Plant Initiative. I founded the organization back in 2005 when I worked at the Suffolk County Soil and Water Conservation District. And one of the founding principles behind LIMPI was the efforts by NRCS to restore grasslands and foreseeing that there's a limited source of truly ecotypic plant material that was available 20 years ago to do so. And so bringing together all the different entities and parties, I was kind of the center of the hub of this wagon wheel in connection to all these different entities, the NRCS, the Plant Materials Center, the farmers that I worked with as a district, geneticists at regional conferences, the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, and then the landowners that had the seed and you know, brought them all together and shared interest of starting this initiative. And we've since have grown from a formal organization to from an informal organization to a formal nonprofit in 2012. I am the volunteer executive director. We have a part-time nursery manager, and we are also advertising for a second part-time nursery manager currently. And we also have carried the state's LISMA program, which is the Long Island Invasive Species Management Area. So we have a manager for that program, as well as a conservation area coordinator, early detection rapid response coordinator, education outreach. It's all supported by our board of directors. And you know, I wanted to take pause to recognize Clara, who used to serve on our board of directors for many years before she moved on with New York City and other areas. So Clara, thank you for your time in that. But we are also supported by majority by volunteers, and we've really thrived and functioned because of those volunteers. We've had part-time staff now for many years, and we hope to hire a full-time executive director in the coming years to help further expand our program. But in these almost 20 years that we've been in place, we have really been focusing on that ecoregion concept to protect the genetics of the native populations through providing a supply of native plant materials. So we've really been focusing on that supply and demand issue and trying to resolve that. from the commercial end of it is to harvest and increase the seed and plant materials from wild to commercial volumes in an ethical way, and get that to the nursery industry, but also then train and educate the public to the understanding of why we want to use these plant materials that have the greatest fitness and adaptability and resilience to climate change and other environmental stressors, so that we're having these maximal functional ecosystems on the landscape. And so in that capacity, we recognize that if the growers are producing this plant material and they're not being asked for by the industry, then they won't continue to produce this material. So we've had a really strong focus on meeting both aspects, both sides of the supply and the demand area, as well as proactively protecting those ecosystems from invasive species through our LISMA program. So our infrastructure and our program is based out of the Sisters of St. Joseph Convent in Brentwood, New York, which is right in the center of Long Island in a very highly urbanized area. Through Suffolk County 0.25% sales tax funding for water quality restoration and improvement, we were able to purchase a large-scale greenhouse and erect 2 grow houses, the hoop houses, and pay rent for a nursery yard, as well as for our founder plots, which is our seed increase plots. And then thanks to the Greenbelt Native Plant Center and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank, MARS-B, we've been able to bank our seed, and they've also provided assistance with the seed cleaning as well. Go ahead, Uli. So how we are focusing on our commercial seed increase is looking at the highly fragmented landscapes and refuges that we have in our functional ecosystems on the island, to harvest from them in ounces, bump that seed material up ethically into pounds, maintaining the maximum amount of genetic diversity within that seed, and then provide that to a commercial grower similar to Ernst Conservation Seed or Roundstone, or we're still exploring this, but other ways to bump it up to that hundreds of thousands of pounds that was discussed in the previous panel, where that seems to be the most challenging aspect at this point due to many limitations related to the cost of the fields and the experience and the seed cleaning and harvesting equipment. So what we do with our founder plot is we've selected areas that are isolated. We've collected, I'd say isolated from other native populations as much as possible, and utilizing ag land tends to be, unfortunately and interestingly, the most suitable areas that have the limited amount of weed pressure. And we focus our collections in the ecoregion focused on Long Island of ecoregion 59 and 84. And we've collected across those landscapes, as mentioned before, trying to get as maximal number of populations, but between 5 and 7 at a minimum in our founder plot. And the number of individuals varies within what we put into our founder plot, but we try to get as many individuals in that plot based upon how much space we have and the number of accessions that we have. So when we're going out to collect, we make sure that we have the permissions from the landowners, and for ethically collections to protect those populations, we go with the 50 individuals, the seed of success protocols, the 20% seed collection max for each collection. And then we're drying. So we're using the infrastructure. We're trading out our greenhouses and founder plot hoop houses for seed drying and propagation and regularly throughout the seasons. And then also using those for seed drying and cleaning as well. So we run all the propagation protocols, the scarification, the stratification, for germinating our own plant material for the founder plot production. And then we also sell the excess material as a founder as a way to increase our fundraising and our foundational financial base. So when we're looking at the founder plot, we take in a number of different considerations that we've been asked to speak on in the panel, but really trying to maximize the genetics. So whatever you're harvesting off the wildlands is what we are, the maximum amount of genetic variability that we're going to have in our founder plot. So we're really cognizant of that in maximizing the number of accessions, the number of individuals per each site or accession, and then the spacing of conagers to make sure that we're minimizing hybridization across those. And then having a limited lifespan, we see individuals within those populations declining readily and falling out of the population. So to limit that drift of genetics, we regularly maintain these founder plots for 8 to 10 years, and sometimes sooner we'll turn them over and start them again. So it's a very dynamic process. Our seed is then stored at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank at Greenbelt Native Plant Center, and we very much appreciate Seth's ongoing assistance that he extends to us both for seed cleaning and storage of our seed, as well as for Ed and Marsby. So that's a really quick introduction of what we do.
Okay. All right, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to stop sharing here. And so thank you for all those fantastic introductions. And let's see, I mean, let's pick up on some of the things that Polly mentioned before. And I think that there's a lot of questions here about maintaining genetic diversity and the different approaches that you can take in doing that. And you had mentioned isolating those from existing natural populations. Is that what the idea is, and what's the concern there? And how much perhaps, and this is again, I feel like what feeds into the necessity for more research, but how much do we not know about what's happening in the genetics of these plots as we kind of set them forth? Let's throw that out to anybody who wants to take that on just to start us.
Well, I think first is, you would really want to be cognizant of what species and the pollination strategies is really going to determine how isolated your plant, that founder plot population is going to be from a native population or from a conager, a same species in the same genera, so that you're limiting the hybridization. The concern that we have with the open pollinated species in the grasses is if you're putting them in close proximity to a native population, you can inadvertently be selecting to a higher rate of that native population just by the proximal distance and the higher abundance of genetic material of that population. So, trying to equally represent each of your accessions in the founder plot is critically important, and trying not to have greater influence from local populations in that genetic variability.
Seth, how do you guys handle this?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the same deal for us. We don't have a ton of wild populations of most plants, and it varies based on pollination and what's around and whether it's wild populations or non-wild. But more of an issue for us is growing different species near each other and hybridization, I would say, than outside populations that we worry about.
And I think you're going to do the best that you can. I think being aware of it and cognizant is your best course of action. But in some of these urban areas, you're limited by the amount of space that you have and also those native populations. So, trying to do the best. And as Seth mentioned, you're more concerned about having the space to distance those species of same genera and hybridization.
Yeah.
I think, Uli, if I could, I think the other thing to keep in mind when it comes to isolation is that as we all look forward in our efforts to increase seed availability, we're going to be looking at collecting and growing the same species from different ecoregions or from different subhabitats. I mean, a lot of species range in their habitats, and you can have some species that, for example, little bluestem, which is widely sought and is already widely available on the market. And it grows on the coastal shorelines of New York City, and it grows on the ridge tops of the Hudson, the mountains in the Hudson Valley. And if you're trying to increase quantity, you want to keep the collections in the founder seed from the little bluestem that you collected and are growing for Hudson Valley ecoregions or for ridgetop style habitat restoration, separate from those that you're going to want to produce for coastal restoration. So making sure you're keeping those distances, keeping those plots separate from one another for the same reasons that Polly and Seth already mentioned, but at a larger scale and for slightly different reasons, not just because of hybridization, but also because you're talking about the potential for mixing genetics for different habitat requirements for the same species.
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually been a number of questions here about whether or not to keep collections from separate ecoregions separate, in other words, and it seems like there's a lot of conventional wisdom to do so, depending on where the seed might end up. Is that what motivates that approach? Or just not wanting to mix the genetic material?
I think it's a little bit of both, at least from my experience with Marcy. We did collect off of the ecoregion level 3 ecoregion maps with the goal of putting the seed back into that ecoregion in the long term. I think there is increasing understanding, and again, this is another need for research, but there is an increasing understanding that might not be necessary for every single species out there. And for some species, we might want to go to even smaller scales. So that's why the level 3 sort of, fall in this bucket where it's a conservative approach. So yeah.
I'd say that if you're collecting an ecoregion scale and keeping those populations separate, then you can always do what you would like with them moving forward, and adding them to a seed mix or not, you're still maintaining those distance. For us on Long Island, I guess I would say is, and for land managers and those that are, looking to do founder production, you're going to know your environment the best. And there's a question about whether or not we enmesh our 59 and our 84. And when I look at our ecoregion lines, I don't think they're completely accurate. The way that they're defined, and they exclude the Hempstead Plains from the Atlantic Coastal Pine Barrens ecoregion and put it into ecoregion 59. And I don't think that's accurate based upon the soil types, the genetics, the formidable forces that have created that ecosystem. So in that concept, we do include, we utilize the ecoregions as a foundational guiding seed transfer zone, but it's not necessarily hard and fast. As the producer of that seed, you're the most experienced and knowledgeable really about those ecosystems and what you need the seed for. So, I think there's some leniency and ability for you to make a professional decision based on what your needs are and what you're seeing in the landscape.
Sefra?
I just think there's some really exciting research out there. Jessamine Finch, the plant geneticist at Native Plant Trust, and I, and a few others, I think we're on this really wonderful talk by Anna Bukharova, I think I'm saying her name right, that talks about rapid evolution under new environmental conditions, because I think there is a lot of these questions around, are these founder plots increasing genetic diversity? Is this doing the work that we want to do? And her white papers, I don't think are published yet, but her data was speaking towards that, yes, this was increasing genetic diversity. So it's really encouraging that this model of seed increase can help from that genetic diversity standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, on my 20-minute commute to work, I go through 3 ecoregions, and I think it really does kind of break down in the city a little bit, where, going back to Polly, we're just trying to do our best and know the habitats that it come from and where it's going, but it's going all over the city. It's coming from all over the region. So we do limited sources. We source from pretty limited populations, and they might have been together at one point, but we're not at our scale doing like true ecoregion hard boundaries.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also worth just taking a step back too and looking at not letting the perfect be the enemy of good work that we're doing. And even from a pragmatic standpoint, that as lots of people, as Ed and Sarah Tangren's paper have shown, that people have been bringing in seed from other ecoregions for a long time, and we don't really know what is happening with the influx of all this genetic material into our local populations and wild populations, nor do we really know the influence of cultivated plants. In other words, if we're planting, cultivars of natives on a larger scale, how those genetics are. But again, going back to what Michael said, we're really trying to hone in on best practices, I think. I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk about scale of production. And I think this is, as we try to wrap our heads around the volume and quantity and how to match that with the interest in people getting involved. Maybe a few questions like how small can a founder plot be to really be effective to maintain genetic diversity, and then what are, on the other side, what are the challenges of something that may be acres or tens of acres or hundreds of acres in size? So maybe, you know, Sefra, I don't know how big the plots are at the hickories, for example, but I imagine it would probably be on the smaller end. So maybe start with you.
Sure. So we basically, just like you would grow a crop of tomatoes or a cucumber crop, we put most of our 200 plugs of each species in a 4x60 traditional row. And that has seemed to work for us for most of the species that we've been working with. As we get into grasses and some other things, it might have to shift, but we're able to have quite a few different plots and species in a pretty condensed area. So that's been the model that we have been working off of. But a lot of that, you know, those numbers and things did come from Greenbelt. So I don't know, Seth, if you want to talk about what your size.
Yeah, roughly the same scale wise. Some of our plots for Forbes are generally around 500 square feet with maybe 300, 400, 500 plugs, depending on the species. And that'll give us about a couple pounds of seed. Most of those plots are installed from plugs into landscape fabric, just based on our scale and labor availability and the land we have and the weed pressure. That will give us a couple pounds of seed for like a goldenrod or an aster. And that, I mean, going down at like 0.1 pounds per acre for a restoration mix gives you a fair amount of acreage for the city seed needs. It doesn't really work that way for the warm season grasses, the bigger prairie grasses that we grow, where you're seeding them at much heavier rates. So they're much bigger seeds. As a side note, they have a much lower value on the market. So that is where the system kind of breaks down for us, that there's a lot more demand for grasses and much more harder to grow on that scale without getting harvesting equipment and kind of new methods of growing and more land.
Clara, Polly, do you guys care to comment on that about scalability, or, you know, how to increase this in a sustainable way?
I think you really need to look at what you have for staff resources, harvesting, weed management. You know, the easy part is planting the founder's plot, and the hard part is maintaining, documenting. So when we plant in rows. We identify what accessions are in rows, how many plants were established in those rows, and we track that so that if a plant dies out, we can plant another individual from that same session back in to maximize the lifespan of that plot and limit the second generation recruitment from just natural, you know, seed shed that does occur, and in inbreeding that results. But then we use weed fabric. I highly recommend using the permanent weed fabric instead of the annual weed fabric, because weeds are really your greatest enemy, and then they also not only compete, but they also can contaminate your seed, and you won't be meeting your 5% or less requirements for purity. So really taking into consideration what you have available, because you have to be able to do all the weeding, even with the weed fabric. You have to be able to harvest multiple times. For what we do, we have 1,000 square foot per forb. And then for the grasses, we've doubled that. And then for the Asclepias tuberosa, we've tripled that, just based on the interest in the particular species for restoration. I say if you have enough land, you know, you can make that founder plot as big as you want it to be. It's just making sure that you have enough individuals from that population. You know, I'd say greater than 50 individuals from each population to maximize that diversity. And the more individuals you have, the better the genetic diversity will be in your founder plot. So whatever you establish in that founder plot is going to be the maximal genetic diversity that you have. That's what your starting genetic potential is. And it will only reduce from there.
And I think it really emphasizes the importance of the initial collections from which you are growing those plants. And I just wanted to stress that again, as we're beginning to build the pieces of the supply chain, that the initial seed collection and all of the thought and consideration that goes into that is, to pardon the pun, really foundational for the success of the increased programs.
Right.
So I wanted to pivot again a little bit and talk about some of the challenges in like harvesting and cleaning these different seeds. And I feel like many people think that there's just like one size fits all equipment that is out there to clean all the different kinds of seeds. And maybe there's not enough of a realization that it is almost species specific in terms of the size and three-dimensionality of the seed itself. And from conversations I've had with other people, that, you know, you almost have to be kind of a like DIY engineer to modify equipment to make it work. You know, and again, a lot of this equipment was designed for agricultural uses for which the seed is more consistent. And so here we are trying to kind of adapt it to, you know, 80, 90 different kinds of species. Like what is that like? What are the challenges like to get this equipment to work for you?
Well, I think that challenge in and of itself is also why getting to the bulk seed level, you know, Seth mentioned the quantity that the city produces at Greenbelt Native Plant Center for asters is possibly enough to meet our needs, but for grasses is not. And that's, you know, the cleaning process, you lose a lot of seed material, which means you also lose genetic diversity. And so having those larger, it's only effective to have those larger plots if you can afford to lose an increasing amount of seed material. And that's because the seed cleaning equipment isn't super precise. And I agree, Uli, that you do have to be a little bit of a DIY, you know, see a problem in a machine that isn't precise for the seed that you're cleaning and tailor it for the temporary cleaning of that. It's also really time consuming. It's really can be really large equipment. I mean, the warehouse space that Seth cleans the Greenbelt Native Plant Center season is rather large. And so, you know, I've visited a few different plant material centers where all they do is clean large quantities of seed, or not all they do, but a good portion of what they do. And, you know, I think the solution, or a possible solution there, is again, a situation where you have a shared resource, where you have everyone chipping in to work towards using the same bits of equipment, and you have individuals who are trained how to use that equipment, because just as many different machines there are to clean the different seeds and the different little tricks we learn to adapt our machines to clean different seed, you need specialized special training for staff to operate the equipment. And because it's so space and you know, financially expensive, it in a lot of ways can only get done, at least get started, with a large sort of group effort, pooling of resources to share.
I think one thing that we've done at CT NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association, with our grant funding, is we were able to buy that really cool Winnow Wizard machine that I showed you for 0.4 seconds, because after, you know, spending an entire winter cleaning Joe Pye weed seed in my mom's basement, it's like, well, this really probably isn't going to get us where we need to go quickly enough. And so I think like that's where the whole seed hunters things come in. It's like, what does the seed look like? Which sieve will clean it, right? And then you have at Greenbelt this like well-detailed manual after decades of figuring out which screen can clean which seed well enough. But I think, like, just to clarify for the audience out there, there's the seed cleaning from the F0, the wild population, just to germinate those original plugs. And then you put those 200 plugs in, and then from our founder plot of Joe Pye weed, then we're collecting millions of Joe Pye weed seed. So I always say, like, it's too late to be pessimistic, folks. And like the ROI of seed is so encouraging, because you plant one and then you get thousands, but then you got to clean it to be able to then give it to like a bulking increase that we're really talking about, that can have enough for the departments of transportation and these end users that need, you know, like the swimming pools of yarrow that you see when you're out west. But just to get back to the seed cleaning point, because I go on a little bit of a tangent, our Winnow Wizard was bought with the intention of being available to all CNOFA members. So anyone within the Northeast Organic Farming Association who wants to clean seed, be it a native seed or a bean seed, they can have this shared resource. And as we build the seed literacy and we build community around seed growing on the East Coast versus where it's really predominant on the West Coast, with the Northeast Organic Seed Conferences and so forth, we need these shared resources and these seed hubs, thus the entire point of facilitating the seed supply chain, to be able to amplify the amount of plant genetic material we're truly talking about to do the restoration ecology that needs to be done in our highly fragmented, you know, Northeast region.
Yeah,
Thank you.
well, I think the other aspect is to evaluate as well is not just the equipment, but the space. So, you know, as Sefra is saying, you go out, you collect your ounces from the wild, you have to clean those. Sometimes you end up with, you know, hundreds of these little collections. It's more frustrating to clean each one of those little ones than it is a big one. But when you're collecting off these founder plots, you need a lot of space to be able to dry that seed, and making sure that you have a cool, dry space that is going to dry the seed out, not induce disease or reduce the viability of the seed, but then, you know, that's also not too hot. And so I see that as, you know, and also a challenge is on the force side of the cleaning is the collection of the seed, where you're collecting as much of the seed as possible so that you're not having to address as much of the inert material, and balancing the efficiency of harvesting from the field and then cleaning in where you're doing the production, especially when you're first getting going and you're you know, trying to figure out what equipment you want to purchase and what would be the most useful and versatile for you.
Yeah. Could you comment just quickly on like why it's important to clean all the inert material or as much as possible away from the seed? You know, why not leave the chaff on?
We're cleaning.
Yep, go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, we're cleaning for storage and get these massive plants down to something go in a bag into our cooler with pretty limited space. We're cleaning to remove weed seeds, and we're cleaning to remove pathogens and whatever else might be in there. It's not, I think, always important to clean seed. Like if you're able to, you know, cut some plants and move them, and you can do that, and you can't remove the fluffer masters or appendages from grass seeds, I think that's fine to do. It's pretty variable over a pretty long time. We built up a pretty expensive collection of machines, and they have their pluses and minuses. And yeah, as Clara was saying, you're always doing selection, you're always losing seed.
Are there like sanitation concerns?
We don't have a lot of sanitation concerns. We're trying not to mix populations and mix collections just to kind of keep them pure, but we never had real issues with spreading pathogens around. I think most of the pathogens that we have kind of live in our fields and stay in our fields, and that's what we have trouble getting rid of more so than on the seed going to other sites.
I would add that with the seed cleaning, you know, you want to balance the time that's invested in cleaning that seed down for your space limitations, but also the more you clean that seed down, the more that seed can get damaged and broken. And so balancing how clean you really need it to be is really important. And also considering, you know, who's the end user and how is that seed going to get into the ground for that seed to soil contact. So if it, you know, making sure that they have the right seeding equipment, they're using a Truax, you know, with the seeder that will have the auger to pull the seed down, especially fluffy seed that has the awns on it where they might stick together, compared to something like a solidago that might stick together, as compared to a switchgrass that's more of like a sesame seed that would just fall through the seeder. So those are the different additional considerations regarding your seed cleaning that you might want to take into consideration.
And I can see Heather McCargo making a comment in the chat, and you know, when she's talking about the home scale version and winter sowing, which she has great, beautiful diagrams that teach you how to do winter sowing, that's one thing. But if we're talking about Eco 59, the farmer-led seed collective, our seed has to be purely clean so that when you put in a quarter tablespoon of seed, you know exactly how many seeds that you're actually selling. So it's just a metric of, again, yeah, as you're saying, end user.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's a huge challenge. Even when we're cleaning, you have some numbers based on, you know, weight, but if you have a lot of chaff and other material in there, now you're trying to estimate what the viability is and how many seeds that you're stratifying. And, you know, sometimes, you know, really it's a swag. You're using your best educated guess, and you have great germination and more seedlings than you could ever want. And other times you don't, you know, so you have to take into consideration that inert material and the influence on the seed weight.
Yeah, I mean, there were some comments yesterday too, and then a few from this morning about, you know, the difference between, you know, direct sowing and drill seeding and these sorts of restoration projects versus actually planting plugs, and how, you know, the success rates of those sorts of things. But I wanted to, in the sort of last few minutes that we have here, I wanted to pivot again a little bit and talk about the importance of data collection and documentation, and you know, labeling of seeds, and to some extent too, you know, is there a standard, you know, an industry standard? Do we have one? How easy is it for one organization to share data and information with another, or does everybody just kind of maintain their own Excel sheets or whatever it might be? You know, I think this is another sort of network, bigger issue that, you know, we talk about how important documentation is in the collection process, and it needs to follow through the increase process. But that information is also not just useful for the person themselves, but it is useful in the, you know, to the larger network. So, you know, what do you guys use, and what are the challenges? What are the advantages of those particular approaches?
So we moved to using an ARC Online form so that when the person's in the field, they can collect the data, and most importantly, get the GPS point on where that data is being collected. We collect, obviously, species information, associated species, time of, you know, phenology related to the time of seed set, and, you know, how much seed is being produced, what the number of individuals in the population are, time of year, and, you know, how much of that population that you've, you know, estimated that you've collected from as a base. But, you know, the site tends to be the most, in addition to that information, the most important part if you're going for source identified certification for your seed, because you need to be able to document that to the seed certifying agency, as, you know, true to type.
Who certifies the seed?
It's by state. So
Okay.
in New York State, it's through Cornell, I believe.
Okay.
I have to say, I'm sure the Ecotype project's a little bit more grassroots, obviously, than you know, New York Parks and in terms of like how we do our accessions and things. But I think that that special journal issue from the Society of Ecological Restoration, what there, as was mentioned yesterday, we sit in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and the International Network for Seed-Based Restoration had a panel of seed networks all over the world. And the Ecotype project, we presented there saying like, oh, great, I'm sure Australia's figured it out. And they're sitting there and all these other countries are going, we're asking the same questions you are. So that was created as a shared template that anyone who wants to replicate these models that we're talking about here can start to have a shared baseline around your germ tests, how you're labeling your seeds, how your accessions can follow from seed collector to farmer to nurserymen and women. And then we do need that shared labeling. That's what the Ecotype project logo was. You know, that was our initial intent of that socially conscious branding. So when you saw the Ecotype project name, you knew best practices with seed collecting, best practices of organic farming, best nursery practices. And I think that's largely important to this conversation that we're having today is what is that shared Northeast regional labeling mechanism that we can all use, so that when all of us doing this work in different places, but for the same end goals, can really have like the organic food movement had for now, you know, restoration, seed, and so forth. So we mark, you know, the farm, the year, where the seed was collected and so forth, but it's certainly not fancy as it should and could be.
Yeah, and that's where I go back to trying to be very progressive with using the Survey 123 form with data collection. So if you're looking to do seed collection by organization, or having it be like a seed bank like Mars B, and then you're submitting your collection information for banking, then you can have it set up where you identify the collector and the species, and then it's easier to tag. And that's what we're trying to do, is to try to do it like a universal sequence in documenting from collection all the way down into seed banking. So we're not having to do like 16 different pivot tables and spreadsheets and tabs. And for the collector, the individual collecting, it makes it much easier to collect that data immediately in the field, instead of just writing all the information on a bag and then trying to remember to fill out your seed collection form, and then taking it back and making sure that they stay together, and then somebody transcribes that information into an Excel spreadsheet. Always breaks down. So having that digital ability to input that information on your phone in the field to a database on the backside that's held by a particular organization has been very helpful to me in the data management.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, for me, it also speaks to again, the need for more funding for these things, that, you know, seed increase programs, like you said, the easy part is like growing the plants and putting them in the ground, but there's so much more, particularly back end things, that are necessary to ensure, you know, good data quality and consistency throughout the whole process.
Uli, there's just one question I can elaborate on. Somebody asked if you need to have Survey Esri to access. So to use the Survey 123 form, you can create a form that anybody in the public can use. So if you have volunteer collectors, they don't need to have access to Esri. It's just the sponsor organization that's collecting the data on the backside that would produce that spreadsheet and the form and coordinate that data. So you can put that form out as a link, as a QR code to anyone. They can just take a picture of it with their phone, pull up this or bookmark the web page and fill out the survey request form. You don't have to have an Esri license.
Can I say one other thing as well, Uli?
Sure.
So just a lot of the great work you heard Eve Allen present yesterday, and she's really kind of putting together this cohort around progressing this need for the Northeast Regional Seed Hub conversation. And I just think one thing here, as we kind of wrap up this seed increase conversation, a really important goal of this is having a shared target species list, because we've talked about workhorse species and so forth. But if all of us have seed banked from these few ecoregions that exist in the Northeast, how can we work collectively and collaboratively together so that we're doing these increases, not in a silo, but to know, okay, Seth's got those species, so we're fine there and we can do these, which can really increase our arcs of genetic diversity, and then be able to get to the woodies and get to the trees. And, you know, with more collective funding, as we can go in together as a cohort and a collective around all this, we can really make sure that we're increasing and maintaining and sharing that genetic diversity to the levels that we really need to be.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's very important to have that genetic information about, you know, how similar or different are these populations, especially in the Atlantic coastal plain. So as you're saying, Sefra, you know, do we need to be Long Island specific? Do we need to be ecoregion specific? You know, how diverse are these plant populations, and what species do we need to do more finer scale ecotypic seed production versus wider scale, and not recreating the wheel of work that's already been done, or maybe adding in the genetics from another population. So it's diversifying the genetics, but not having everyone do their own small little seed initiative, because it's super expensive and it's a lot of time. 10 years to get a viable product of, you know, founder plot scale for some of these species.
And again, it for me emphasizes how the research needs to feed into the species selection and the increased programs and the wild collection, and how all these different aspects of it really feed back on each other. So, so as much as I would love to keep this conversation going, I have to unfortunately draw it to a close. I want to thank Clara, Seth, Polly, and Sefra very much for your conversations today. This was really, really wonderful. We are going to break for 30 minutes for lunch, and we'll come back about 12:45 to welcome our next panel, which will discuss seed use. So everybody, big hand applause to our panelists here and our other panelists this morning. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your lunch. We'll see you in 30 minutes.
Thanks, Uli. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you.
Bye.
Bye.